Hi everyone, Stepan here. In today's video I'm going to cover the Blackburne variation of the Queen's Gambit declined, also known as the Harvit's attack, which is, I'm happy to say, one of the definitely most interesting variations you could play with white, and it's quite uncommon compared to other normal Queen's Gambit declined variations. So I'm looking at it from white's perspective because it's basically white's choice, is this move bishop f4, which signifies the variation. Before we get into the opening, I'm sorry, the Blackburne variation was named after Joseph Henry Blackburn, a British professional chess player from the 19th century. So he was born in the middle of the 19th century, and he managed to have a successful chess career from when he was about 20 or 25, so very successful. He was nicknamed the Black Death. So okay, a very successful aggressive chess player, and he came up with this opening. So after d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, knight f6, knight f3, bishop e7. This is all very, very normal. Here bishop g5 is the first move, and this leads then to some of the main lines of the Queen's Gambit declined, or mainer lines. The Blackburn is bishop to f4. And now what's the idea behind bishop f4? One of the main ideas of bishop f4 instead of bishop g5 is to avoid the early piece exchanges, which, if you remember the Lasker defense we covered recently, or the classical or orthodox Queen's Gambit declined, when the bishop is developed to g5, then this knight will often either go to e4, to h5, or maybe even to d7, and these two bishops are going to be traded off. Furthermore, when the knight, for example, in the Lasker defense jumps into e4, very often that will lead to the defense of the knights, the city knight for the e4 knight as well. So bishop f4 restricts that immediately. And the main disadvantage is that, well, the bishop is not controlling the d5 square. So in this position, if the bishop were on g5, then it's indirectly controlling d5. At the moment, it's not controlling d5, so black doesn't have to defend it really. Black doesn't have to do anything. So for example, if instead of bishop to e7, he plays bishop to g5, then let's say black castles, e3. Now c5 is not such a strong move. I mean, it can be played, but after bishop f6, for example, bishop f6, cd, ed, dc, and you can see that black has some structural difficulties. Still, it's nothing major. I'm just trying to show you the difference. This is also almost normal. This position with c5 has, well, been played about 6 times. It's not that good, but it doesn't lose directly. But if you play bishop f4, and after castles e3, c5 is played, now this move is quite playable. There is no bishop takes knight. There is no pressure on d5 because the d5 pawn is defended. So this is a huge disadvantage compared to normal Queen's Gambit declined positions. This bishop is needed for the pressure on d5. But what you get in exchange, as I said, is a very strong bishop cutting across the board, stopping piece exchanges, and most importantly, if you compare these two bishops, I'm sorry, I forgot to turn off the sound on my phone. I'm going to have to, sorry about that, really. I usually remember, this time I forgot. Okay. So bishop f4, yeah, if you compared these two bishops, the c1 bishop, which is now on f4, and the c8 bishop, then it's obvious that this London system bishop is much better than this semi-Slav or French defense bishop. Okay, the reason for the Blackburn defense not being the main line, even though it's very aggressive, is that the positions get insane. And some of the lines we are going to look at are worse than the Botevnik semi-Slav or the most aggressive of the dragons and hyper-accelerated dragons, and it gets completely crazy. So the two moves that are forced here are castles and e3. Now, as opposed to the London system, this setup is better for white because of the pawn on c4 and the knight on c3. Usually the pawn is on c3, the knight is on d2, and this now gives white more space and more central control. And here black can choose between 3 different options: knight bd7, b6, and c5. And c5 is the main line for a reason, and yeah, that's just crazy. Knight b to d7 is the so-called two knights defense, which is slightly passive, but still quite good. And b6 is the fianchetto defense, which is perhaps the most solid way for black to play. Let's look at c5 first. c5 is sharp using the fact that there is no pressure on d5, as I said. Wait, I'm going to open a separate chapter. Sorry, c5. After c5, the main idea is d takes c5. That's the move, and bishop takes c5, because you can't allow black to break through your center. And now white can go a3 or queen to c2, and the alternative is c takes d5. C takes d5 is a calm move and a sideline. If you go c d5, then knight takes d5, knight takes d5, e takes d5, gives black an isolated queen's pawn, obviously, but after a3, knight to c6, there is a lot of pressure on white's position, and even though he's structurally better, I wouldn't mind being black here. Playing with this isolated queen's pawn can be fine if you can get your knight here, for example, but for the moment the pawn can also just be dissolved, and usually black succeeds in playing d4, and if you don't want to take, well, if you take, you can just play e4, and this should be slightly better for you, blunting this bishop. There are some tricks with taking. Of course, the bishop is staring at h7, so knight takes d4, and now bishop to e5 should be played, and this is sort of forced. Bishop takes d4 now. You didn't want to take with the knight and then bishop takes, because yeah, bishop takes d4 and bishop takes g6 should be sort of equal. Bishop takes f2. This is forced but not considered that good. e4 is just better, as you can see in this position after queen d1, rook d1, and h or f takes. It's equal material, quite drawish, and that's why after d4 almost nobody is going to play takes. They play e4. You want to play for a win and use black's structural disadvantage. You know, in this position after e4 something like bishop g4 can be played, h3, bishop h5, g4, bishop g6, but this is not active and you will not have a big advantage with white in these lines, which is why most players with white don't play c takes d5. So if we go back after c5, which is the main move for black, this is basically an invitation to a very aggressive game. D takes c5, bishop takes c5, and now if white doesn't oblige to enter a very aggressive nice position, he can go c d5 and have a slight structural edge, but I would advise against that. The other two moves that we are going to be looking at transpose, and you can either start with queen c2 or a3. It's basically going to transpose on the next move. So you can either go a3 here. I'm sorry, after c5, d takes c5, bishop takes c5. You can either go a3 here, you can go queen c2 here, or on the next move, queen c2 or a3. Let's start with queen to c2. The idea behind queen to c2 is a quick attack, believe it or not. Queenside play, central play, and kingside play at the same time, and games are completely mad. So after knight to c6, you continue with a3. Now a3 is a very important move, controlling the b4 square and also preparing b4 in some variations. But black has a good response here. The forced move here is queen to a5. Queen to a5 is of course stopping the move b4. If you play b4, that can just be taken because the pawn is pinned. It's also reinforcing knight b4 because that cannot be taken because the rook is pinned. So what can white do here? There are actually three moves. There is one move that can still lead to normal calm positions, although that's a sideline which isn't as good. So knight to d2 is the calm move, which again I wouldn't recommend. Bishop to e7, moving the bishop away. Bishop to g3, saving the bishop from this. Usually there are some variations where e takes f is possible, but you don't want to allow that. Bishop to d7, bishop to e2, rook f to c8, castles. This is normal. This is normal. White has a slight advantage, a bit more space on the queen side. Slightly awkward knight on d2, but it's fine. And now, the two main moves after knight to c6 are either rook to d1 or castles queenside. after queen a5, I'm sorry, a3, queen a5. Either rook to d1 or castles queenside, and they're both very, very complicated. Let's look at rook to d1 first. Rook to d1 is the main move. After rook d1, black continues with bishop to e7, because now b4 is definitely a threat. So rook d1 is a forcing move. Bishop to e2 developing, and now, since the bishop has wasted the tempo to come to e2, black now takes. D takes c4, forcing, well, either a recapture now or later. If you don't recapture, then b5 does save the pawn, so bishop takes c4. And now e5. And here's where stuff gets tricky. After e5, you need to save your bishop. Obviously, you're not sacrificing a piece. This is very dangerous because e4 and your bishop could be attacked by the queen. So you go bishop g3. And white goes bishop g4. Now, e4 is not a threat, of course, because it's still defended by two pieces after you castle. But if you don't castle, e4 wins a piece, wins the knight. So castles, and now if e4, you don't have to move the knight, lose the exchange, you can just play knight takes e4. So rook a to c8, increasing the pressure. So if e4, knight takes e4, knight takes e4, there might be some b5 idea, spinning the bishop, or starting with b5. So maybe if white wastes a move, maybe b5, bishop moves, and now e4 could be dangerous because of this discovery. Okay. However, after rook a to c8, white continues with the move knight to d5, which, again, extremely sharp. If you don't know this move, you are never playing it during a game, because you're basically removing one defender from your queen and lining it up with black's rook. And after knight to d5, the main move is b5. Bishop takes f3 has been tried, knight takes d5 has been tried, e4 has been tried. This discovery is not that dangerous, actually. You can take with the rook, you can take with the queen, it's better to take with the rook. And after black's queen moves, you are now fine. Bishop to d3, for example, and looking at h7. So this idea with with knight to d5 actually works. b5, and after b5, believe it or not, knight to g5 is the main move. And now I'm already way below the level to understand and play this. I can understand it tactically after analyzing, but if I found myself in a position during a real game to actually play this position out of book, it would take me hours to understand it. Okay, so knight g5. So what's the idea? The idea is, if you take my bishop, I'm going to take your knight, and it's checkmate. So this much we can understand. So if b takes c4, that's simple. Knight takes f6, something takes f6, it's checkmate, or king h8, it's checkmate again. So you cannot take the bishop. So knight g5 has to be responded to with g6. This is forced, and the bishop wasn't under attack. And now a very strange decision by white, in my opinion, is to play b4, which gains space, loosens the a3 pawn, but I guess it's justified. So b4, first of all, if the pawn is taken, I believe you can just trap the queen with rook to a1, so that doesn't work. So queen to a6, and now knight takes e7, again leaving this bishop hanging, and of course inviting the c6 knight to take to improve the pin. So knight takes, but now okay, pause the video if you want here. So the idea is bishop takes f7, and after rook takes f7, queen to b3, and this is devastating. This position is just very hard to play for black. I turned on the engine so that you can see the evaluation. The engine changes its mind. It's about plus 0.5 to plus 1. So white is better, but white is visually winning, and in most games white is practically winning. It's just really hard to play this. So let's go over that once again. So we have bishop to f4, the Blackburne variation, and now in the main line, castles, e3, c5, the main move. dc5, bishop c5, queen to c2 or a3 is going to transpose. So now a3, you might have started with a3, and then knight c6 is obviously the best move. So then queen c2. And now queen to a5 have to stop b4, rook to d1, reinforcing b4, bishop e7, bishop e2, d takes c4, bishop takes c4, e5, bishop g3, bishop to g4, threatening e4, so castles, rook ace to c8, knight to d5, and now after b5, you continue with knight to g5, and if black goes wrong here, it's game over, but g6, b4, the pawn cannot be taken, queen to a6, and now knight e7, knight e7, bishop f7, rook f7, queen b3, rook to c4 is the main move. Black can hold this, but I would be scared to try. It just seems very, very dangerous. If we count the material, white, of course, has knight and bishop. Black has two knights and the bishop, so black is virtually a piece up for a pawn, but white is about to win an exchange, so the material is actually going to be equal, but with a huge difference in king safety. And white could, of course, opt for this immediately, takes, and bishop takes. So now we have two rooks and two pawns for a knight and bishop. So that's material advantage for, sorry, we have a rook and two pawns for a knight and bishop, for two knights. So it's almost material equality, but yeah, as I said, much easier to play for white. Okay, the other move after knight to c6, if you don't want to go rook to d1, which is insane, you can go castles, which is even worse. Yeah, this just, I'm sorry, in this position after queen to a5, castles instead of rook d1 is even more complicated. So bishop to e7, again, you have to stop b4. Although in this position you don't really, because queen a6 comes with tempo, but still, bishop e7 is a safe move. And here, if I asked you to guess the main move, I don't think you would guess the main move. So the main move is g4. The main move is g4, and black doesn't take it. I will show you why. The main idea is dc4, and after bishop takes c4, this position continues with e5, which is the main move, and now g5, e takes f4, g takes f6, bishop takes f6, and knight to d5. White has 5 pawns, black has 6 pawns. Black's bishop shouldn't really be, well, it's going to be taken. Black doesn't have that much time to do something. If you try bishop to d8, which is visually the best move, then rook h to g1 and you are in trouble. So the main move instead of bishop to d8 is just knight to e7, allowing this capture. And after rook check, you go knight g6 or king h8. King h8 is the main move, and you have this knight for the defense of your king. These positions have been played by Anand, Kramnik, Kasparov. This is a very popular variation on the highest levels. Most games actually end in a draw, but that's the highest levels. Still, look at this pawn structure. It's not really a pawn up for black, so it's not that he has a material advantage. And now it's hard to argue whose king is safer. I would much rather be white in this position. My pieces, all of my pieces are perfectly placed, whereas black is yet to develop his queen side. His queen is sort of offside because there's no attack going on. The knight is good in the defense, but not doing that much. The only bad piece is my knight, which could come to d4, but I really want it in the attack, and all of these squares seem very, very occupied. But after castle's queenside, bishop e7, if g4 is taken, then actually c takes d5 seems to be the best move, and that's the refutation of knight g4, e5, and now bishop g3, you have to move the knight somewhere, so knight to b8, and now we go d6, and this is just crushing. This is almost over. You have rook d5 coming up, you have, well, if he goes, let's say bishop to f6, then you continue with h3, and after knight h6, this is just busted. You can win a pawn here with rook to d5. You can get your bishop into play on c4, and this lack of development is going to be the end. So yeah, in the main line after c5, the Blackburn is quite complicated. dc, bishop c, and now either a3 or queen to c2. Queen to c2, knight c6. a3, queen a5, and now choose between rook d1 and castles. On the highest levels, I think very, very strong players prefer castles, but rook d1 is what I would probably choose. Okay, now let's look at knight b to d7. If black wishes to avoid all of this stuff being crushed with this deadly attack, then knight b to d7 is an alternative, but it allows white to grab a ton of space on the queen side with c5. Obviously, since black didn't play c5 himself, then well, why not play c5? I'd just like to mention one sideline, a3, which is an alternative to the c5 expansion, leading to isolated queen pawn positions for black. So if you are looking for a structural advantage, this variation of the Blackburn could be good for you. So if they go knight b d7, just a3, and now of course you are preparing c5 b4, so c5 has to stop your expansion. c d5, knight d5, knight d5, e d5, dc5, and an isolated queen's pawn. And in this position, I wouldn't say black has that much. He wants to, of course, go knight f6, knight e4, take this bishop, take this pawn, put his bishop on d6. But with this defender on f4, it's not that easy to cause any damage. So c5 for white is the most aggressive choice. a3 is still interesting. And in this position, black can either choose to attack the bishop or not to attack the bishop. So knight h5 is the main move. c6 is the sideline. Let's go over c6 first, which I kind of prefer. Now this is a very passive Semislav sort of position for black, in which he has a bad c8 bishop, has to do something about that. So okay, in this position, bishop to d3 played by white, which is normal, and now b6, and this is something you are going to see in most variations of this knight b d7 line. b4, securing the c5 pawn, so if it takes, you of course want to take with the b pawn, and after a5, luckily for white, this rook is defended, so a3, that can all be played. And now white, as you can see, has a tremendous amount of space, and this pyramid of pawns with the top on c5, which means enormous space advantage, much better piece activity, and much better chances according to the engines, but also in practical play. Now, proving that is harder, but if you know what to do with space, then this is a big edge. Bishop to a6. Whoever has less space, of course, wants to trade off pieces, so this is a good strategy. Castles, rook to c8. I'm sorry, queen to c8. h3, saving the bishop. So now if knight h5, the bishop goes back. Queen to b7. Queen to c2. Black is trying to open things up here. That's why he is rerouting his pieces towards the queen side. And now bishop takes d3, queen takes d3, rook to a7, and now black is doubling up over here and wants to open things up, hence the move of queen to d1, because if takes, you can't have taken because the rook was hanging. After queen d1, it's possible. So there's some tension, but utilizing this space advantage is pretty hard, and you don't have that many good squares for your pieces. Your knight on f3 is, well, opposed by this knight. Your bishop is really staring at nothing. Your c3 knight would have to do some serious maneuvering to enter the position. Maybe knight a4, knight b6 is a threat, but it can be parried. So a space advantage without minor pieces to utilize it is really useless. It's only a theoretical advantage. h6 here. And now bishop to h2, and sort of waiting game in which black is definitely worse in theory and visually, but it's hard to prove. So c6 is actually a fine way to play. So if you start with knight b to d7, c5 by white, c6 is a calm variation where white is going to have this pawn chain, but you can play around it. The alternative is knight to h5, which is sharper. White doesn't save the bishop. White simply plays bishop to d3. This is an aggressive opening, so he wants to develop, not retreat. Knight takes f4. E takes f4. b6, again striking at the center. b4, and we again have the same idea. a5, a3, c6. Sort of transposes. The difference is that this pawn is on f4, and I'm going to say this is an advantage for white, because this pawn means even more space. The lack of the f6 knight means less control over e4, and once this knight tries to challenge e4, well, then my knight is sort of able to jump into e5 and put pressure on c6. So again, a good alternative to c6, but I prefer white in this position despite the structural disadvantage. The positions could continue queen c7 with very similar plans to what we saw before. Yeah, the difference is that in this position, of course, white could defend with queen to b2, defending the rook, but a much more active move is b5, sorry, opening the position up. And now you're giving up your space advantage, kind of, and you're ruining your pawn structure. You're not going to be left with a pawn on c5 and the black weakness on c6, but it's very playable. Of course, he has to take. There's nothing better but to take. So c takes b5, knight takes d5 is the move here because the bishop is hanging. So in this position, you wanted to get rid of the c pawn to take on d5. If they don't take, well, then they have to move the rook, and that seems really unpleasant. If they move the rook, you could probably just defend. You could, well, let's see if this has ever been played, actually. f5 has been played once, b takes c6 has been played once. I think b takes c6, queen takes c6, and knight to b5 is perfectly fine. And after something like rook to b7, let's see. This was actually played by Jan Ludwig Hammer and Eric Hansen. Jan Ludwig Hammer was white. Okay, so this is something to explore, but I think the idea after b5 is to take for black, and that just makes your life simpler. Knight takes d5, so a pawn trade, e takes d5, and now queen takes e7, taking the bishop, so it wasn't a piece sacrifice. Rook to c8. And you can see that white's center has crumbled, and black has these two very dangerous pawns. So I think this position is very good for black. Of course, white is equal or better according to the engines, but I think black has great practical chances. Of course, if white does nothing and lets this pawn advance, then it's going to be easy. But in this position, of course, black has to trade this off. There's no way to defend. So bc5, rook b5, rook to e6 attacking the queen, queen to g5, and now rook to b6, a4 defending the rook, rook b5, a b5, knight f6, and the position is dead equal, as most interesting positions are in chess. So the two nice defense to the Blackburn, the knight b to d7 lines, avoid aggression, but you are going to be playing with less space, which is hard. Now let's look at the last option, the b6 fianchetto defense. b6 is very similar to the Tartakower defense and to Queen's Indian defense systems, where you either develop your bishop to b7 or to a6. I'm talking about the Queen's Indian defense. Therefore, either trading this bishop off or having a great bishop on the diagonal. Now, this is a sideline. It's not as common, so you're not going to be seeing that as often. Again, here c takes d5 is the main move, and knight takes d5 or e takes d5 can be played. But after b6, white doesn't have to play c takes d5. Two alternatives are rook c1 and bishop to d3, which are both fine moves. And in most variations, you are going to be developing your bishop to d3 anyway, and you are going to be developing your rook to c1 anyway. The difference is that if you go bishop d3 immediately, black, of course, waits until you develop your bishop until he takes, so takes, bishop takes c4, and now either bishop b7 or bishop a6. More popular is bishop b7, castles, a6, now preparing b5, queen e2, b5, bishop d3, and black has no problems here. He wants to play c5 as soon as possible, as always in these semi-Slav breakthrough type of positions where you manage to fianchetto your bishop. You play c5 and you want to disrupt this center, so c5, and I mean, you have no more problems here as black. The alternative bishop a6 is also okay, offering a bishop trade, bishop c4, queen c4, and again, you go c5, d takes c5, bishop takes c5, castles. Black has absolutely no issues. So, in my opinion, b6 is simpler to play than both knight d7 and c5, but this was just bishop to d3. So after b6, if white plays bishop to d3, dc4, bishop c4, and bishop b7 or bishop a6 is both fine. If he goes rook c1, Then again, bishop b7, c takes d5 should be played by white here, opening up the c file. Knight takes d5, knight takes d5, and queen takes d5, setting up some dangerous threats along the diagonal. A3, of course, defends the pawn. Simple. c5, again, you want to disrupt that central space. Of course, again, if it's taken, then just queen takes queen, king takes queen, and bishop takes c5, or simply bishop takes c5. So in this position, bishop c4 is played, chasing the queen away, queen to d8, and now castles. And again, Queen's Indian type of setup for black, very easy to play. Bishops on b7 and d7 are very powerful, and no problems. Now, let's look at the main line. White doesn't have to go bishop d3 or rook c1, he can go cd5 immediately, which is considered to be best. Knight takes d5 is the main move. E takes d5 is playable, but no need to accept this pawn on d5, which hinders your b7 bishop. This is a Tartakower defense type of position, exactly the same, without, well, this. The bishop is on h4, the pawn is on h6. So bishop to d3, bishop d7, castle, c5 is the idea, and after knight to e5 you go knight to c6. So this is a true Queen's Indian type of position where these central pawns are still, well, vulnerable to tension, and white can choose to create hanging pawns or an isolated queen's pawn, or after, for example, queen f3, c takes d4, knight takes c6, bishop takes c6, e takes d4. Both sides now have an isolated queen's pawn. So e takes d5, I don't like for black, leads to, well, this bishop being worse, so I prefer after c takes d5 in the main line, simply knight takes d5. And of course now after knight takes d5, you have to take with e-pawn, or it's better to take with e-pawn than with the queen. But at least you have not committed your bishop to b7 yet. That's one thing, and you don't have to do it. The knight can come to c6 before you play c5, or after you play c5, you have a choice there as well. The knight can also come to d7 supporting c5, and the knight on f6 is not here, so it gives you some ideas. For example, bishop f6, which can be very useful if this pawn gets targeted after c5. So the main move is bishop to d3, c5, castles, and now knight to c6, very similar to the previous position. And we have rook to c1, and here c4. So here I stopped when I was studying this variation. Why would rook c1 be played? Well, bishop to b5 is one of the moves attacking the knight, but rook to c1 seems to be one of the most popular ways to play. And rook to c1 has, for example, been played by Kirill Georgiev. Well, okay, a list of very strong 25 and 2400 players. So yeah, this position, of course, after rook to c1, you just continue c4, so black is able to grab space. But all in all, playing c takes d5 seems like a very obvious move for white. You can go queen takes d5, of course. I'm going to go over that as well. But e takes d5, as I said, is more popular. And after bishop to d3, c5, castles, knight to c6, for example, rook to c1 or bishop to b5, all seem fine for white. The position is equal. Okay, let's go over queen takes d5 now. After knight takes d5, queen takes d5, develops the queen, and of course doesn't concede to this structural advantage. Bishop to d3, and now queen to a5 check. This is a tricky move because it forces one of the pieces to go back. If neither of the pieces, if the knight doesn't come to d2, then you have to cover with the queen and forfeit castling, right? So knight to d2 underdevelops the knight. And now a very aggressive move again, bishop to a6. So now you are sort of, if you take, which is the best move, if black takes with the queen, you're not castling that easily, so queen to e2 has to be played. But he can also go knight to a6. And now after castles, I like black's position. This seems very active. Again, you're going to strike with c5, and black should once again have no problems. So here, if I had to decide who is better in the Blackburn variation, I would say that white is better if black plays the main line, and that black is better if he goes for b6 and the position is equal if he goes for knight b to d7. So this is just my opinion. The Blackburne variation is very interesting. I hope you have fun with it. I think I will play it with white because it's quite uncommon, and I'm sure many Queen's Gambit declined players don't know it. Let me know what you think. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more chess. Bye.